Right. It says it's recording, so I'll trust it. Okay, so I guess maybe we'll try and do this together, but again, don't feel wigged out if we go too fast. I guess let me know if it's too slow and boring. I guess actually before we start, just a reminder, and I do this, maybe it's OCD, but I check my units pretty much every time I jump onto Max. So again, you go to customize unit setup and just check that the system units are set to meters, and the rest should be okay as default. That way I just know how big things are that I'm working with. So what I might do is start off with a plane. This one probably doesn't matter so much about the scale, but let's make it 5 by 5. And I might just embiggen that guy. I'll turn it to a non-perspective. So to switch between perspective and it just calls it user or orthographic view, you can do it through this guy. So perspective or orthographic, or you can, or you can just type U or P. So P for perspective, U for orthographic user view. I'll also turn the grid off because it inhibits my creativity. So that's good for grid to turn that off. Now what I've also done is I'll turn my segments on, and I've just turned off, reduced the number of segments. So from, I think it's 4 or whatever, to just 1. Okay, I don't need to have that popping up through this. I'll just close that. Close. And what we'll do is we start off with the edit poly modifier. So there's a bunch of different edit tools here. Probably the more powerful of these, I think edit mesh is the very old version. Edit poly, much more powerful, and that's the one that we'll be using. So edit poly has a bunch of stuff in here. It's quite dense, and it lets us modify it. If you remember back to week before, where we looked at splines and editing the vertice positions, like that, you can get in and edit vertices. So I could get in and select the vertice and the sub-object. That's by clicking in here. So these guys have, you've got vertice, edge, border, so that'll kind of select the kind of outer edge of all of that thing. Polygon, and overall element, which when we get more complex multi-component objects, then those guys become more interesting. But let's just select edge for now. And it's worth pointing out, so these guys are here, but you can also get into the sub-object in here. So anywhere where you see these little tabs, the little triangles, it means there's more stuff behind there. So we want edge, and I'll just pick out one edge. Oh, that's okay. And what I can do is, you might remember from last week where we were cloning objects, you can sort of use the edit clone. You can also clone objects by holding down shift. And in this case, we can clone an edge and drag it out. So if I hold shift and move, that clones, or sort of extrudes out the edge. If I select this edge, actually, another thing that I might not have mentioned is if you select an edge like that and hold Control, you can select multiple. So probably the opposite to, no, it's a bit different to Photoshop and other tools. So in Max, you hold Control to add selection, and Alt will deselect. So I can unselect things by holding Alt. I want to hold Control and select multiple, and then I'll hold Shift and I'll drag that surface out. And this is using the, let's pull that out again. And this guy, yep.
Just a quick question. I don't have that little XYZ thing that you've got.
Okay, so this thing is called the gizmo. And there's a shortcut that you can accidentally press which turns it off, which I can't remember what it is. But what that means is your gizmo is hidden, and gosh, can't I remember where it hides this custom user interface?
I think you just got to hit the move button as well, which is the W command, just so that it pops up.
Control Shift X.
Control Shift X. Yeah, there's a spot somewhere in settings where you can hide it or unhide it.
I got it with W.
W. Okay, so you just didn't have your move tool. Okay, that's fine. If you ever lose your gizmo, there is a spot that it hides. Basically, you can turn your gizmo off. I don't know why anyone would want to do that, but you can. Okay, so we can then move these around. You can grab just, it doesn't have to be the whole run there. You grab a couple, drag them out, and we could do, what else could we do? And now there's a bunch of things in here, looping, and I'm not sure how clear that is on the shared screen, but if you click on loop, it'll run the selection sort of straight through. So it finds edges that it's running parallel to. So loop is pretty handy. And I guess if anyone's used SketchUp, it's a little bit, I mean, this is a poly modeler, so it's basically it's probably a slightly less friendly interface of everything you can do in SketchUp in this modifier. You can take a surface and you can extrude it, which is the push me pull you or something in SketchUp. I can't remember. But it's basically kind of pulling and pushing. Pull, push, pull, pot. I don't know, something in SketchUp. And then what else? Oh, and then I guess you can take something that's like, that you make up in a kind of low poly way. And if you want to say this was a bit of a landscape, probably not with those last couple of moves. So this was, imagining this was a bit of a landscape, but I wanted it to be quite sort of a smooth landscape, then you can use a turbo smooth on that. And turbo smooth, quite simple. It's only got a few parameters, and iterations is the one that you probably want to just play with a little bit. Be super careful with it because it'll let you plug in a really large number, and it usually doesn't crash your machine, but it'll hang for a really, really long time. So don't plug in 500 or something like that. And I don't even use the spinner most of the time. I just plug in an exact number because of that reason. So that one's pretty cool. So you can then go back down the stack and change this geometry, and then see, you're kind of working on a piece of low polygon geometry to get a high polygon output. The other thing that's worth noting here is this guy. So if I'm in the edit poly modifier and I click on this guy, which is the show end result, you can toggle that guy on and off. Super useful. It has a shortcut, which I can't remember. Is it Alt apostrophe or something weird? I think I changed mine to Alt E because E sounds like end result. So that's pretty useful, and as you're kind of working on this geometry, you can be just toggling back and forth and seeing if you're getting the result, the kind of landscape form that you're after. The other thing that is, I guess, Turbo Smooth is a fairly blunt instrument in that it sort of smooths off everything in the same kind of way. There are a bunch of other tools that maybe we won't go into now, but there's open subdiv and edge weighting and stuff, which is super cool, but let's not go into that now. But you can also kind of offset spline the kind of edges. So, and again, there's a stack of ways you can do this. And I think, chamfer, let's do it through, probably worth pointing out. So there's all of this stuff, but you've also got this menu here, which has basically a sort of duplication of this stuff, but quite a few more options. So it's got, your loop button. I guess it depends on how you like to work. If you're using this, if you're doing poly modeling all the time, like people doing character modeling, they just set these all up to shortcuts and they just remember them all. I don't do it that often. This is sort of as fun as it gets for me. But I do like to use some of these. So like Swift Loop is quite good. So you can kind of click in here and kind of add topology. So if I pull my, do my turbo smooth back on, you can see that edge gets a kind of crisper, you get a crisper kind of sharper, it's still soft, but it's a sharper corner on that surface. Okay, so maybe have a little bit of a play with that for a moment, and either post questions or just speak out loud about it.
Yeah, Mark, I've got a quick question.
Yep.
Just when I copied the object to make it longer and things, it doesn't have the segments, so the edges, it doesn't copy the edges, it just continues the shape, so you can't really edit the new faces. That makes sense? Like that, where you've got all those edges. One's just one shape going in one direction. Yeah.
So you're not seeing all of the face edges?
Yeah.
So that's either in here, so you can, that might be turned off.
Edge faces.
Yep. So you turn edge faces on, so that way you can see all of these edges. So the toggles for those guys, because they are things that you want to commit to memory. F3 turns it shaded to not shaded, and when it is shaded, F4 turns the edges on and off. And then sometimes you'll be modeling, and if you're in edge mode, so if you're in the sub object and you're editing edges, then you try to select on some other object. It won't let you because it sort of locks you into the editing of this piece of geometry. So that's just a thing to look out for. Okay, we might move on. Are there any questions about that?
Yeah, I've got one. What was the last command you did to kind of get that more pointed edge?
Yep. Okay, so if I've got, so I was just going to point out, so it doesn't have to be just surfaces. They can be any pieces of geometry that you're working with. So it could be a box with different bits and pieces. If you do edit poly, you can use Swift Loop, and if it's not displaying, there's a couple of things. I think if you're not on the default workspace, so if at some point you tinkered with that, these guys might not be there, so you might just reset that to the default. But in here, sometimes it's hidden, which I like to hide it because it takes up screen and I'm working off a laptop. So, but under here, you've got a bunch of tools that you can use that all, or most of them relate to edit poly. And the one that we were using was Swift Loop. So if I'll stick an edit, a turbo smooth on that box. If I want to crispen up one of the corners of the box, I jump back into here, go into my edge, turn end result off, and use the loop, the Swift Loop. And it sort of depends on where your mouse is. So if you hold it along this edge, it'll sort of slice it the other way. If I want this corner here to be sharper, I would add in a Swift Loop there and maybe there. And see that that's sort of tight that up. So that's the Swift Loop. Yeah. And there are a stack of other ways you can do it. So there's the chamfer modifier, and there's the, what is it called? open sub div is quite nice, but that's a nice, simple way to get started. Any other questions before we jump into the next little bit?
Marcus, sorry. How did
Yep.
you dictate when you were doing the turbo smooth how much it smooths the edges?
So that guy, this turbo smooth has iterations. And so that's the number that you want to be a bit careful about. So don't plug in 100. Default is 1, might go 2, 3. This probably wouldn't go more than, well, depending on what you're modeling. If you're wanting to 3D print something and it's a piece of jewelry and it's very fine and you want it to be super smooth and nice, you might up that. But generally, I'd keep it to about 3 iterations. Yeah, and again, there's stacks of different smoothing methods, but this is a nice friendly one to get started on. Any other questions?
You know how under modeling you had the Swift loop? Where is it gone right now?
So that will disappear if I'm not in polyedit.
Okay, that makes sense. All right.
So it's tools or modify specific. Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. All right, I'll jump into the next little bit, which is, again, it's quite related. So there's I mean, polyedit is super powerful, and it is, pretty much a whole, you could spend the whole semester just exploring it, really. One of the things that you can do, say I was happy with this surface, but I wanted to kind of do some, I don't know, like some mounding of the surface, but I want to do that kind of on top of the turbo smooth. You can, of course, do another edit poly on it. And we'll talk about animating edit poly parameters maybe a bit later. But you can use, say if we wanted a couple of little mounds in this that were a bit hard to achieve with just the low poly surface plus the turbo smooth. What I can do is I can move vertices, and I could go in and select individual vertices. I'll move that guy up, and then I can move this guy up, and I could play around with that and try and make a nice soft sort of mound manually. That would be get a little bit dull after a while. So what you can do is you can do selections that are what they call soft selections. So if you pan down a bit, scroll, whatever it is, down to soft selection, if you click on that guy, when I select one of these vertices, you'll notice that it colors things up. And I'm not sure how well this comes across Zoom, but where I've just selected is quite red, and then it sort of fades off orange, yellow, green. And I'll just adjust the fall off amount to be something a bit smaller. So something like that. Now if I move that, so I've just got one vertex selected, but I've got the soft selection turned on. And if I move that one vertex up in the Z, you can see that it distorts, it's selecting the kind of neighboring vertices and affecting that, but based on the distance or the kind of fall off of the soft selection. So this is, imagine you're working on a landscape project, or or it could be a blobject that you're working on. You just have to John Zaha's office or something, and you're controlling your blobs. This is pretty useful to get quite a bit of control over your blob, your blobbing in a way that's pretty quick. And I guess the equivalent would be if you're a Rhino, use Rhino bit. It's you've got a NURB surface and your control points on. I think they call them in Rhino land. So that is soft selection. And you've got, there are stacks of parameters that you can tinker in here. There's and you can see the kind of end result. So if I pull this guy up now, you'll see it's a lot pointier, more pinchy, which might be what you're after.
Marcus.
Yep.
Did you say would you say 3ds Max is has all of the stuff that Rhino has too?
It's probably don't know if it's got all of it. It's certainly got a lot of it. I mean, this is one of the things that, look, you can probably do pretty much everything that Rhino does in Max. Some of the things are going to be much, much harder. Some of them will be much, much easier. And I find that's the way with most kind of CAD programs. Like, you could do a surface like this in SketchUp. It'd just take a lot longer. You could do it in Rhino. This would be probably a lot easier to do in Rhino because you could do it with a NURB surface and, adjust your control point weightings. You could do it in Maya, you could do it in Blender. And I guess, a question that sometimes comes up is, well, which is the best software? Which is the one that I should sink all of my time into learning? Back when I went to university in the good old days of the mid-90s, things were much simpler back then. So basically, there was AutoCAD that you could use for your modeling. I think there was a couple of other options, but no one was using them in practice much. So it was basically you learned AutoCAD, you became a bit of a gun at AutoCAD, and it was easy to get a job. Nowadays, what I'd say is what you need to be really good at is being thrown onto a new piece of software and learning it really quickly. In that you go for a job and they might use Revit, they might use Revit with Rhino, they might use Revit with Maya or Blender, they might use ArchiCAD, they might use or something new that hasn't come out yet. And it does relate to that how-to guide and the kind of knowledge capture stuff, because we want to equip you guys to be able to jump onto something new, be thrown in the deep end, and to be able to have some methods for self-learning. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer to the very simple question, but yeah, you could pretty much do most things that Rhino does. You can do NURBS geometry. It's not, I like to jump on the software that's best for the particular design. If I'm doing some stuff that really lends itself to a bit of a grasshopper routine, then I'll use Rhino. But most of the time, I stick to Max because it feels a bit more fluid to me.
Yeah.
Okie dokie. T-spline. Yeah. Yeah, T-splines, that's a Autodesk plugin, isn't it? I think it's actually.
It was, but Autodesk wrote it for Rhino 5, and when Rhino is developing, and when McNeil was developing Rhino 6, Autodesk redacted the license. So this spline is currently only in Autodesk.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some. We won't go into the history of CAD, not today, but there's a pretty fun, history with, because Rhino was originally written as a plugin for AutoCAD, and then they had a falling out or something. They branched off, did their own thing, but that's why they're so incredibly similar. Okie dokie. So that's soft selection, and I think this is in terms of weekly stuff, that's done in class. This is one that that there's a load of different options in here that you should explore. We've just covered a few little bits and pieces. The only one thing I will show before we move on to the next thing is if you had two boxes, let's just make them pretty simple. I'll just add some segments to the vertical and let's do 3 boxes. Imagining that these are kind of, I don't know, they're too small. If these were buildings, for example, what you can do is you can kind of work on individual buildings, but if you wanted to kind of start to combine multiple objects into one editable poly, what you can do is you can start with one of them, do an edit poly modifier, and there's a command somewhere buried in here called attach, which, where is it? Edit geometry. So it's, I don't know why it was hidden. It's usually pretty easy to find. Attach, and you can attach multiple objects. So now they behave as kind of one thing. You can still move them around separately, and this is where you would use the element in the edit. So you could move this guy separately. You can do all of that kind of local scaling type stuff.
Sorry, Marcus, I just missed it. Would you be able to just show that attached thing again? Sorry.
Yep. So I'll just add another box. So if I've got a box over here, what you need to do is you apply an edit poly. So it's got all of this stuff. And then you scroll down to here, which is under the edit geometry. And one of those guys is attach. If you click on the little button next, if you've got to kind of combine lots of things, you can do it by a list, which we won't do now, but you can attach and then click on the object. So now, and if I right click to get out of that, otherwise I'll keep attaching things. So that's now one piece of geometry. It lists it as box 4. If I want to move stuff within that, I can use the move element, and that will select the whole shebang. Another kind of, I think it's, I don't know, it depends on your preferences architecturally, but you can select multiple faces, and there's, again, like we were extruding before, you can do a thing called bridge, and worth pointing out. So here where we've got, you can extrude, or you can extrude with settings. If I bridge, it will kind of, basically take those two surfaces and squish them together. I'll undo that. If I bridge with settings, it brings up this little guy. So I could get a lot more control. So I might bridge that with some more segments, and what that one does, I could twist it. So I could do some twisting. You can kind of balloon it out, is one of them. Or you can sort of, pull it in. So that's bridging. So I don't know how you might use that on a sky bridge or something if you're doing some sort of twin towery type arrangement, tall. Lots of floors, a few subdivisions. Edit poly, attach, and then if we went into the polygon, could attach those ones. It's I think you can. It's a little bit flaky, but you can kind of, depends on the order that you select these things. You can select multiple. It's a bit inconsistent with the result, but let's try it. If we go back to bridge, yeah, it worked. Sometimes it won't, but I think it's like if you select this face and then this face, it'll try and blend those two or bridge those. Yeah, so you could do your Stephen Hawley kind of bridgey things. Yeah, twisting. No, maybe not. Yeah. So that's a brief introduction to edit poly. Just for my curiosity. If you stuck a turbo smooth on, it's not too bad. Yeah. Another thing that's worth noting, keep an eye on the time. There's other stuff that you can do. So in Edit Poly, you can also just select surfaces and delete them. So I jump in and select stuff, you can delete it. You can also apply modifiers on top of that. So if I had, let's say, I did turbo smooth that. Oh, it's pretty ugly. Oh, careful, Marcus. So I was really happy with the look of that. So I kind of am. if I wanted to give that some thickness, like turn that into, say, a bit of a facade or a shell, what you can do is there's a really nice plugin called, Shell, and Shell will let you thicken a surface basically to make it into a solid. So without the shell, with the shell. So super useful, you know, if you're ever doing a kind of, I don't know, like a mathematical surface-y type project, you might want to shell it to be able to print it, for example, so you can use shell for that. There's stacks of different parameters in here that are worth playing with. For example, you can have it select surfaces. Actually, I'll go through that in a moment. Straighten corners is something that I like to do. Just gives a kind of slightly more like a surface offsetty kind of feel. It's usually what I prefer. So I'll just copy that guy onto here. So that's taking that surface from something that was just basically a thin surface to something that should 3D print. Well, when I say it should 3D print, if you've got any self-intersecting surfaces, like where your geometry kind of offsets but then kind of goes over the top of itself, it probably will need a bit of cleanup to be able to 3D print. Yeah, so that's the shell command. Do you want to have a little play with that before we move on to the next thing?
Yeah, I had a question about the bridge. So when I'm bridging, I can't edit it. Like the second I draw the line, the setting goes away straight away. So I can't really adjust or twist to do anything with it.
Yeah. Okay. So with edit poly, I'll just get rid of that guy. So edit poly it'll kind of act on whatever's kind of selected. So if I select these guys, actually let's do it with extrude instead. So I'll just select some surfaces, and if I click on the extrude, this guy should come up. But if I click in here, it deselects those surfaces. So it doesn't know what to be extruding. So it's a little bit, it's probably a little unnatural in the way it feels, but it's quite useful. Is that what you mean, Jaffa?
I'm gonna try it that way and see if it works. It just when I select bridge, the setting just like didn't appear. It just went away. Didn't allow me to. Oh, now it works. Yeah, so I have to select them first.
You select them first. That's right.
Okay.
And so it's pretty useful because those particular things they kind of work a little bit like plugins or modifiers rather. And this is worth kind of knowing. I probably don't need to worry that much, but it's good to know that this exists. At the top of the edit poly, there's model or animate. I usually switch that across to animate because what that allows me to do is it kind of treats it as though this is a weird modifier. So if I use extrude, and I'll extrude with parameters, so let's say extrude 10, I can get out of that and I can go and do something over here. And if I come back to that, back into my sub-object, because I had animate on, it only remembers one thing, which is a bit of a shame, but if I go back into my extrude, it remembers that was extruded 10. I can change that amount, or I can change which polygon that's being applied to. So that's this becomes super useful in that you can kind of basically use it as a kind of weird just do this procedure to the sub-object elements that I'm kind of selecting, which I guess, you know, if you think about, well, let's make a bit of a ground plane, and this will actually relate to what we're about to go into. So if I make a surface on the ground here, it's got lots of segments, and I do an edit poly on that. Edit poly. what I can do is just select, I'll just use this guy so I don't accidentally move stuff. Control. Yep, something like that. I can turn on animate, and I could do a, let's try bevel this time, and I'll adjust those parameters. That's not quite what I want. Actually, I want this first one to change over to the, is it local? How did that work? There we go, by polygon. So that's then like a kind of weird pyramid modifier thing, which I can, again, come back, go into the sub-object and, you know, tinker with that bevel shape so I can make it more pointy, much taller, and so on. The other thing that's quite good for, you can do stuff like this, is you could apply a modifier just to the stuff that's selected in the sub-object. So, so if I stick that on, okay, let's do, let me think, oh yeah. So let's do it on just a blank surface first. So if I have a plane, I could stick a noise modifier on that. I don't think we've talked about noise modifiers, but noise modifier just sort of wiggles space, basically. You don't need to tell it how much to wiggle the space, so I just want to wiggle in Z, and I'll probably have to tell it what scale the wiggle needs to happen at. So that's doing my space wiggle.
Sorry, Marcus, could you just do that again? I missed that one.
Yep. Okay, so what I did is I just made a plane with, let's do a set number, 20 by 20 segments. And the plugin that the modifier is called noise. And then you need to tell it the strength of the noise. So this is basically how much distortion in different directions. We just want to move it up in the Z. So I can say, I don't know, let's just drag the spinner up. So you can see that it's distorting that surface. So it's basically applying a kind of random surface wobble on it. And then the scale is something that you can also play with. So that's a sort of tighter noise, which might be what you're after. Let's scale it up a bit and emphasize that. Excuse me. So that's a noise modifier, which if you've done an edit poly or an edit or a mesh select is another modifier I'll show you in a second. If you apply that noise to this object, depending on whether you've got the sub-object selected, if I have the sub-object selected and then I go back up to a noise, you can see that, hopefully that's clear, let's see. It's not wiggling the whole piece of geometry, it's just wiggling the thing that's selected in the sub-object. And so this is super useful for a bunch of stuff in urban design and architecture kind of modeling. So that's a kind of, you can do, confine a bunch of extrusions to a surface that might be like an urban design height limit, like I showed with the, I don't know if anyone remembers last week, it's all a bit of a blur, but that lecture that I gave talking about the Venice Biennale, that was basically a kind of just distorted surface based on pedestrian access, that conforming or sort of constraining the heights of buildings. But you could also use it with, let's get rid of the noise. What we could do is you could do a face extrude modifier. So let's do edit poly, and I'll just use edit poly to select stuff. So I could select everything and then deselect marks. That would be better. So this was some streets with some blocks or something. And then I could do a face extrude. Let's see if this works. So that could be, that height could be my height limit. So it's 40 meters or something. But this way I can go back and go, well, I want to turn that little bit into a park, or maybe I want to have some courtyards in these. So I can go into the edit poly and basically deselect. So Alt, there's my lazy perimeter block models. And again, this is where you'd want to be able to toggle your end results on and off.
How do you deselect surfaces from the face extrude?
How did I select
How do
them?
you deselect them? So let's say you did it and now you want to like make some of them go flat again.
Yep. Okay. So in the sub object, so they're selected. If I want to deselect some, you hold down Alt and click.
Okay.
So
Okay.
it's a bit. I find it's one of the more frustrating things because most things it's Shift and in Photoshop to add to selection you do Shift and there's a Control for. But in Max it's Control to add, Alt to remove from a selection. You probably change you could probably edit your shortcuts if it was super frustrating. I'm pretty used to it now, but
Marcus,
Yep.
I just want to ask you, what's the difference between doing a plane and extrude some of the faces, or building each one individually, other than using the modify? What's the difference? Will it affect the result in later stage?
So what I try to do is model in a procedural way where I can, and it's not always possible. Sometimes you have to kind of collapse things and do it a bit more manually. What I'm trying to do is have it so I can change my mind kind of endlessly and to have that flexibility of making changes without having to go through and manually extrude faces. So I could do that whole process in a more manual way. So I could come in here, I could do that as an edit poly. I could select, and I can just go in and grab the stuff that I want. And I could extrude, and if I remember to do the animate, then you could come back and modify it. But if I use extrude in the manual way, I can kind of go in and do that. But once I've done that, to go back and change my mind about, well, actually, I want this not to be part of the extrusion, I'd have to go, you basically have to go kind of back in. Oh, geez.
I think what you mean, it would the 3D Max will treat it all as a group, not like as individual objects.
Yeah. So, and that way, you're kind of building up your procedures. So you started with the simple thing as a large group of the city. So yeah, like that would be another way you could do all of this. You could make it with boxes. So you could go in and you could draw each of these buildings individually. And look, often that's totally the right way to go about it, particularly if you're modeling existing conditions or something. They're not changed much. But you're looking at, say, an urban design project and you're testing out 50 different options. I think, is it Karl Popper or something? The more kind of iterations you go through, the better the design gets. And by doing it this way, where you go in and edit the heights of each of these individually, that slows you down, which means you can't test out as many iterations. So I think, yeah, I like this as a very quick way to throw in some massing and test ideas. test ideas quickly in a very sort of fluid way. Another nice one that you can do, sorry, does that answer that question?
Yes, thanks.
Yes. Yeah, hotkeys. Yeah, that's, I mean, yeah, you can change your hotkeys. They've moved the location in 2021, so now it's got its own hotkey editor, which makes things a lot simpler. But you can basically find your command in here. I mean, one that I use all the time, which drives me bonkers that it's not a default, but hide. I like to, it's just a basic hide by selection. So I usually set hide by selected as just H. And you can save that. So then, whoops, did I not press done? Anyway, but yeah, you can edit your shortcuts to be whatever you want. Okay, so what I was going to show you next, so that's, and I guess that's edit poly, you know, it's not particularly exciting if you're just doing a straight up extrude, but what you can do on top of that, because that those initial edit polys are still kind of available for you, is you could do that first face extrude, and you could then do another face extrude on top of that. So it could be, you know, you could stick a material on this lower level that was retail, and this could be generic office building or whatever. The other thing you can do is use, you could stick the noise modifier across the top, or you could get rid of all of those guys. Good job. And you could use a thing which don't look for it, you won't have it yet, but one of my favorite modifiers, plugin modifiers, is a thing called Greeble. And it's a very quick way to make some basic kind of random building-ish looking geometry. So it's got stacks of things you can tinker with in here, but you've got your kind of minimum height, so I might set that to be 4 meters. My maximum height might be 24. Taper, I generally set the taper to 0 because, you know, we're pretending we're modeling lots of buildings. And what else? And you can change materials, and you can do complex materials, which we'll get into later. But you can also control the, you know, I think of these as kind of lift motor rooms and you know, mechanical services on top. So you can sort of stick those guys in or not. So Greeble's pretty useful. I mean, my typical example that I like to use because you know, because of nerd reasons, is if you've got, say, 2 spheres that an object, and I've got a Boolean subtraction of the first one with a subtraction. You might want to Greeble that. You can see how that might be useful if you're, you know, a bit of a nerd. Though one thing that I didn't include, and this is where you probably want to get your mesh selection, which I'll mesh select. So mesh select is exactly the same as edit poly, but it's not for editing, it's just for selecting. If I selected all except for my exhaust port, what's it called? The you know, the run with the exhaust port. I can't remember now. There we go. Yes. So you could okay. Yeah. So that's hopefully, you know, just getting you excited about that idea. And so to get that plugin working, what we can do is we can just do a search for 3ds Max Greeble. Oh, you posted it. So it's Max Clanky. There he is. It's actually a guy called Tom Hudson. His name is. who's, I think he worked in 3ds Max, you know, the development since the early 90s. There you go. He's been doing it since Max release 3. So the plugin is there, and basically you go down to the version of Max you're running. So if you're running 2018, you click on that one. 2019. If you're using 2020 or 2021, the plugins work for both now. You click on this guy, and there's the Greeble plugin, and it's a DLM file, which is just the kind of bundled up bit of scripted stuff. You then need to put that into Max, and this is where, actually, because we're not using labs, you can just drag it in directly. So on your C drive under program files, you'll have Autodesk, whichever version of Max you're using. So here's my 2021. Under the folder plugins, you just drag that DLL, it is dynamic link library, whatever file, just drag that guy in to here. And then what you need to do is, let's do it the easy way. You just close Max and open it again, and that plugin will load.
So the 2020 version works on the 21?
Yeah.
Okay. And sorry, also about the extrude faces. So can you, like, let's say you have let's say we have a residential and we have, say, commercial level. Can you adjust that, or no, manually? Like the heights individually?
So, well, say, you can. You could do it with, there's a few different ways you could do it. You could do them as separate. So if I got rid of that guy, and actually let's do it again. Yeah. So if I had that as let's do mesh select, and I grab these guys. Oh, come on. And I did a what was it? Extrude. Poly. No. Face extrude on that. You could then do a separate select, where you go through and select different ones. And you could do another face extrude on that. And they can be different amounts. It can get pretty, well, yeah, you got to kind of remember what you're doing. But in this case, it should let you change them independently. But what you'd probably do is you'd, this would be where I would change the name of the the modifier. So, which I don't think we've talked about, but to do that, you can right click on that guy and rename. So I would call it face extrude because that's what it's doing, but it's the, whatever that was, low density. So that one, high density. Yeah, so you name them appropriately to what they're doing. And that's certainly worth doing when you've got more complex bits of geometry and you're doing some edit polys that might be, maybe you're doing not a Greeble on that, you're doing might be a edit poly, it's animated, and this time you're doing like an inset. It's another one you can do, which is kind of useful. So where you inset that locally, like that, and then you might do another edit poly on top of that, where you're go away, where you are animating some sort of bevel in here. And so you're starting to build up, it's one simple sphere, but it's got a bunch of complex things on top. So in that case, I would definitely start to rename these because you just, you know, you start to lose track of which thing's doing what. So is the modifier working for everybody?
Yeah.
Is it not working for anybody? So here's the point where I'd like to be able to see all of your screens. I don't know if it'll let everybody share their screens simultaneously. I'd also need a much larger monitor to be able to see what's going on, but
I think it actually can allow multiple users to share, and I think you can flip between them. I'm not sure, I haven't done that, but I know there's an option that allows you to allow multiple users to share the screen. So yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, feel free to all share your screens at the same time. I don't know, there might be a setting I'd have to dig for. You try it. Okay, so that's, I mean, that's my favorite plugin. It's probably the most fun, but it's worth knowing that there's literally hundreds, maybe thousands of plugins for Macs, and there's also hundreds and hundreds of scripts for Macs. I mean, one of the benefits of, you know, it's been around a pretty long time. It's had a lot of people working on the, you know, adding to the capability, and it's had a, I guess, you know, it's got a pretty strong animation community. So like, you know, Food for Rhino, that kind of community of sharing stuff, Max has its equivalents. So one is Script Spot, which has a bunch of these things that you can have a look in, scripts. And, you know, there's lots of them really useful. Some of them really just super weird. You know, there's things about how to control facial expressions on orcs and really quite strange stuff. I mean, sweep, I don't know, I guess someone might be doing some heritage work and get really into the sweep profile on fire. But yeah, just hundreds of them. Here you go. Like there's 517 pages of this stuff. But there's stacks of them worth kind of looking at the different kind of capabilities. One that, like if there's ones that kind of contour creator is something that's pretty useful. Spline, I think you have to. Some of them aren't free, but usually they're either free or a couple of bucks. Stuff like Voronoi Fracture is pretty nice. What's a nice? Actually, let's use. It's probably not the way we'll do it now, but Contour Creator. If you click on that guy, it should have a script file here. So contours, and this is what it looks like. And you know, if anyone's interested in doing this stuff, it's you can do some really cool stuff pretty simply with Max Script. But for the purposes of this subject, you don't have to. But if you're interested, by all means, go for it. It's you know, super powerful. So that's basically, most of the scripts are open. Like if they're open up, you know, you can get in here and you can tinker with the codes. Or you can you can install them. I will just drag this guy and see if that works. No, it didn't. I'll try running the script. So scripts, well, there's sort of different sorts of scripts. They'll either, when you run them, they'll either bring up a little dialog box, or sometimes they will they'll look like they've done nothing, but they've actually installed somewhere that you need to kind of set up as a button. Sometimes they pop up in the utilities section as a kind of additional script. I don't know. It looks like you have to drag it from your downloads. Yeah, so this is where it was plonked in mine. So you can just drag that in from there, or you can run it. So under scripting, and again, there's stacks of things in here, but you can just run a script. So run, and you dig around to wherever you put it. And so in here, I'll just do something much simpler. Just stick that noise modifier back on. Yep. If I pick on this guy and I want to contour in the Z, let's just create contours. Ooh, that's bad. I did wrong. Well, that one's done. Oh. It might have a. Oh, it's a, yeah. Okay. That one looks like it's incompatible. That's a shame. Most of the scripts should run on all versions of Max, but it looks like there might be some conflict. So when that script is quite old, so maybe there's things have changed and it doesn't work. That's a bummer.
Is there another way within the program to create contours?
Yeah, there's a bunch of ways. I mean, that's probably one of the well. So I would probably do. A spell would be useful. Contour.
I think that's probably a Vue tool.
Is it Vue?
Yeah. Vue mesh contours. That's the MCJ tool. I'll post it in the chat. So try that one.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. Okay. So it's Vue. Very nice guy. So what in this case, I think we would download. In this case, it'll be an MCG routine, which just I think you've got to extract MCG files. There we go. I wasn't expecting to have to show you this one, but I think from memory you have to create a rectangle, and then you go into Vue, click on the mesh contour thing, pick a mesh. No.
Well, this one is really weird. I think for this one, probably need to click on the empty area.
Yeah.
And
then pick a mesh.
Yeah.
And then pick a rectangle.
Yeah.
Yeah. That could be a lot simpler. But there it is. So easy. But I mean, this one, it's a little bit clunky to get going, but super powerful. And then once you've worked out that fairly clunky little start process, you can it's kind of parametric, so it has that. It works like a modifier in that you can change that noise amount and scale and stuff. And the contour creation will, yeah, it'll update. So it's sort of a live contour thing, which is kind of useful. I'm sure everyone will have lots of questions about that one because that was pretty badly explained. But basically, what you're doing is, you find these things, you have a bit of a read, and it's good to just read through and skim things that you think might be useful. He does go through the process in a little video, which if I was expecting that other one not to work, I would have watched that. But the script's super powerful. MCG, so the max creation graph is it's probably a bit like Rhino's Grasshopper in that you can, if you're interested, you can go into that whole area of max creation graph stuff. So there's a graph editor, and I haven't spent the time. It's relatively new, but there's operators and lots of tutorials about it. But yes, it's very powerful. Maybe worth a bit of a dig. Okay, so that is that was the thing I was wanting to show you. The other thing, which before we kind of move on to the next chunk, so maybe we'll dig up maybe another plugin, which this is probably the most exciting plugin. Probably Tyflow.
Yeah.
There we go. It's a really boring looking website, but actually if you go to the gallery, it's pretty excitement. So Tyflow is a, I don't want to be in Instagram. Tyflow is a plugin that kind of reproduces one of Max's built-in particle systems, but it rebuilds it so that it runs on multiple threads on your CPU. It uses your GPU's power, and it does, I don't know, it's particles that kind of respond to each other. You can do kind of agent-based things. They kind of, you set them up, program them to interact and go through events. Super fun-looking graphics. This is a bunch of particles that are programmed to behave in a certain way. Endless fun. I think we won't go into this week, but maybe next week or the week after, we might get Jenny to cover some of this stuff in more detail. This one's probably as a cyclist, I find the most uncomfortable. A little bit loud. Oh. Oh. That one still hurts every time I see it. I don't think I've seen it. Jesus. Yeah, watch that one for hours. So it has soft bodies, explosions. There's a whole kind of inbuilt material thing. Just endlessly powerful. We won't even scratch the surface. We'll scratch the surface of the surface today. But what we want to do is go to Tyflow, to the downloads, which it's already in the chat. So and download. There's that's changed. Yeah, I think just the first one. Yeah, just the first one. Definitely, we'll have a look at the samples and stuff a bit, in the next couple of weeks. But for now, just download and accept these conditions. They're pretty reasonable. I think it's like if you lose your work, then that's kind of your risk. if you've got time on your hands to read the conditions. But and download that, and then the process is exactly the same as installing Greeble. Basically, you drag the appropriate DLL, I think it's a DLL file, into your plugins folder on Macs on the C drive. It's getting a bit bigger now. It used to be teeny tiny.
Hey Marcus, could I just confirm, would it be okay if we sort of, rather than looking into every aspect of this lecture, to sort of focus on a few for the weekly class activities for our Miro?
Yeah, well, I guess, I mean, they won't all be as dense as this, but I mean, I think you probably want to kind of capture the main bits and go into as much detail about them as you think is appropriate. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of up to you a bit on how in depth you want to cover everything. I mean, we have gone through a heap this week, so you know, we didn't go through that much in the last 2 weeks. So I think they'll probably balance out a bit, but I mean, yeah, you don't have to cover off everything necessarily.
Okay.
So yes, so once that's downloaded, it'll look like that. So there's your different versions of Max. 2020 again will work in 2021. So you just drag that in and restart your Macs. I think I've already done it. So yeah, we won't. So you'll know if you go to the Create panel, there'll be a TieFlow button. If it's got that, then it's installed correctly. I didn't want to go into that, into actual particles today, but the other thing you'll notice if it's working is you'll have a stack of new modifiers. So if you're scrolling through your modifiers, there's a big collection of them in here, which include, he's got his own version of booleans, and so there's heaps of really cool stuff in here that you can play with. And because I think a lot of them are a lot more efficient than the built-in Macs, because he's kind of you know, rebuilt them so they can multi-thread. And you should also, I think it puts them under a new create. So you've got, you know, your standard primitive compound objects, but there's also TieFlow objects. And maybe I'll just give you a moment to get those downloads going and installed and restarted before we start this bit.
Marcus, do you have to paste the TieFlow files into 3ds Max or into 3ds Max plugin?
Into plugins.
Oh, okay. So you have to get it out. Do you have to get it out of the folder as well?
So you go Programs,
Yeah.
Autodesk,
Yeah.
Max, plugins, wherever that is, and then you drag, wherever it is, this guy.
Mm-hmm.
You drag that guy into here.
Okay, I guess that one.
And then you, then you restart Max.
All right, cool. Thank you.
That's okay.
Done.
Okay, have we got it up and running? Got it? Everybody's got it? Beautiful. All right, well this will be the last little bit of stuff that we go through in Max for today. Is that a thumbs up that it's nearly over, Colin?
Is it meant to just be a logo?
So TieFlow, when you, yeah, if you just do that, that's just the logo. But We won't do the TIFlow particle systems yet because we don't want to melt your brains. Well, not today anyway. So what we'll do is we'll do something a lot simpler. So let's just make a bunch of, let's use teapots because they've got lots of vertices. So just make a bunch of teapots, different sizes, something like so. Doesn't really matter of the size. And actually, I might do a bit of a spline as well. Spline. So I've got a bunch of bits and pieces in here. It doesn't really matter what you've got as long as they've got some vertices. And actually, I'll make a box just to show what I mean by the way it kind of deals with vertices. No, it's not really that simple like that. Okay. If you've installed it, you should have that little TIFlow button here. But we want to actually use a special piece of Ty geometry. Ty is just the dude's name is Tyson. He must be, now there's a young guy he must be reasonably well off financially because he's not ever asked for money for this at all. And just clearly kind of in the genius territory. Anyway, so our good friend Ty's written this amazing set of plugins. If you click on the standard primitives and we go down to TIFlow, this has two buttons. We might do cache stuff way later, but Ty Mesher is the one we're interested in. We just click in here, and that basically it's a slightly neater version of that thing we did before of the contours, but he's got a little place marker, which is probably a little more tidy. And in here, we've got an area where we can add bits of geometry. So what we will do is we'll pick, and I'll just add that guy. And then I think, so what I can do then is I can select that guy and jump across to the modifier stack. And I want to pick, so you can do it in multiple ways. You can select stuff. No, how does that add selected if you have to get out of it? I think probably just pick is probably the way to do it. Pick. And what that does is it basically sticks a little blob. Let me add the box as well. Sticks a little blob onto every vertice. So, vertices are the kind of where your edges meet. And then what you can do with those vertice blobs, is you can see where they're nice and close, they kind of blob into one another. And if you adjust some of the settings in here, so there's you scroll down, there's different radii for the blobs. So you can adjust how big your blobs are. And I mean, we won't go through all of these. I think this is a good one to kind of have a bit of a play with, during the week. But there's different types of it's like a voxel smoothing. So sort of how chunky. There's different like Gaussian type, more blurry, smoother one. I don't know exactly how these come about. There's probably reading the instructions would be a good idea. It also, the idea of this is it can be applied to particles, so which we won't do now, but you can have these sort of, you can have it as simulating fluids, could be blood splatters, or, probably, I don't know, you're thinking of sort of architectural things to do with. And I think maybe that's probably, let's not go into it in too much detail. But it does also work on splines, which is very cool. And it's also, it's also quite good in that it's, again, it makes this blob mesh, but if you select that original geometry in the teapot there, you can move that around. And depending on how powerful your laptop or PC is, that can either be a It's actually, you know, even if you've got a crappy machine, it'll still be reasonably good because it's pretty efficient. And it also, so if you modify that geometry to have more segments, for example, so I could increase the number of segments. So now that's kind of blobbing that in a nice way. Splines, you can add more segments. I think in this case, we would, where is it? It's weird, they've moved interpolation to the bottom for some reason. You could add, so with splines, you can add more kind of curviness to the splines if you add more steps. So let's make that 25. Yeah. So now I've got this amazingly grotesque looking piece of geometry. And again, very nicely, you can edit the original spline. So if I go into the sub object, actually, it's a bit hard to see what's going on. What I might do is let's try this. I'll shift and move as an instance. So now I've got a copy of that spline, but over here I can see what I'm doing. And then I can get in here and modify my weird spline blob creation. Oh yeah, that's much better. So the architecture of air, you can do some nice inflatable buildings with this. The teapot's quite excellent.
Marcus, I did the shift move for the line, but it's not attached to the original. Maybe I missed a step.
So when you hold shift and move something, it brings up this dialog, which is, I think we did cover it briefly last week, about cloning. So you've got copy, instance, and reference. If we want them to be kind of identical, we change one and all of the other clones change. But the simple one is instance, so we really instance that. And so then if we change this guy, it's going to chug a bit because it's doing some pretty complex computation over here, but they should all change. Is that the missing bit, the clone type?
Yeah, I think that was it. Thanks.
Cool.
Marcus.
Yeah.
So you know how now the teapots and everything are green. My green is kind of weird. Like I don't know. Like the segments look weird. Like yours look way smoother. Does that have to do anything with the size of how big the pod was?
So it'll be about the. So there's a few things that will affect it. One is the number of segments in the teapot. So this is going to be a bit hard to see, but so the number of segments in the pot, because it puts the blobs on every vertex. So if you remember the box, which was, I can find it. This is where naming things and hiding things and stuff becomes a bit more useful. I can't get to it. Is it? Oh, it's way in there. So this is my box. It has, if it's got one, you'll get a very different kind of outcome. So there's my, that's with 1 versus 5. And then the other thing that can affect how kind of smooth that fairly grotesque looking object looks is there's there are a bunch of settings in here that you can have a bit of a play with. So there's the voxel size, and there's also the voxel filtering. And I don't completely understand the way this works, but some of these, yeah, I don't know why it's doing it, but like Gaussian seems to give a slightly prettier, smoother surface. Unfortunately, my life isn't that fun that I get to play with this sort of geometry. I wish I was a student again doing student projects, because I'd be breaking out the tide blob mesher all the time. But yeah, so those are some of the things that can affect the smoothness. I don't think I'd be putting a turbo smooth on this one. It's already gets a bit laggy, but yeah, you could play with the settings a bit. It's looking a little bit cellulite there.
I tried, like I did play around with it, but it just looks different. So I just want to double check if it's still going to work or not. It's just I did place a screenshot on Facebook.
Okey-dokey. That was pretty good.
Okay, because yours looked way smaller, like the segments, the space in between them. I even tried to increase them and stuff. They still looked like that, so I wasn't sure.
So that's, it could be about the radius, maybe. So it depends on how big your geometry was to start with. So my geometry is quite large, so when you change the radius, yeah. So I think you might be just working with much smaller geometry, so you might want to tinker with the radius. Not quite sure what it does. And also there's voxel resolution, which play with that one. Yeah, voxel resolution might be the one to tinker with. So if you do a smaller voxel resolution, it'll be sort of finer mesh, more. Yeah, and you can see it really chugs, takes a lot longer. Don't set voxel resolution to 0 would be my advice, because I suspect in this
That was the one. That was the issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. I increased my radius to 25 and it kind of not crashed, but it got very slow, so I had to reduce it. But it was the other one, the voxel size.
Yeah, and this is where again, it's super clever. He's got it set up so you can set up use a very chunky voxel size, but then you can render it with a very small voxel size. So as you're kind of just working on it, it's chunky low res. But if you hit the render, it'll increase the density of the kind of the complexity of the mesh. Okay, any other questions on any of that stuff?
Yeah, just for me, when I'm doing it, it only lets me pick one object, and then I have to pick other objects by doing a whole new one. Is that normal or?
No, so what you should be able to do is, let me just delete that guy. You should be able to make your tie mesher. I think probably the safest thing is just go straight across to modify panel and then pick. What's that one do? Pick on your objects. I don't know why it doesn't let you just leave pick going, but
For me, when I was clicking pick, it like deselects everything and just picks the one.
if I pick a second time, it gets out of there.
And then the second time I pick, it won't do anything.
Right. So I'm not sure. If you go back into here and click on pick, if that's highlighted, the pick is highlighted, should let you add another thing. I'm not quite sure. Yeah, without being able to see the screen, it's a bit tricky. That's what it should do. I suspect that he's maybe broken it a little, because it used to let you pick, you know, like the Pro Booleans or whatever, you could pick multiple things.
It's working now. I think it's because I wasn't in the modifier section.
Okay. Excellent. Any other questions on any of that?
What's TETS on the mode? I know it's blob mesh, but what's TETS?
Checks?
TETS. On the mode when you go blob mesh or input geometry and there's TETS.
That's a very good question.
Is that something else, or is it completely like it doesn't matter?
I don't know. I haven't noticed that before. TETS. I think probably, I don't want to get all, you know, old person on here or something, but it's probably worth having a look in here. iMeasure. Yeah, I think it's probably worth looking into the, yeah, there we go. He will have explained it all in here.
Was that the top? Sort of. There it is.
Input particles, yeah, okay. Tetrahedron, okay, so it's more about the particle stuff. So what you know, you might start to look at this in the next couple of weeks, but you know, if you set up a tide flow particle system that could be, you know, particles that are, you know, you could simulate, I'm thinking of an urban design equivalent, but in the animation world, they might simulate custard being poured onto a bowl of bananas or something. And you could use the particles to sort of do the fluid dynamics, and then you would mesh those with the blob mesh to kind of create the custodiousness of it. This stuff, you know, I think this is, you know, we've got a kind of cool set of tools that are looking for uses in our case. And it might be that you looked at, actually one of the things Francis was doing a couple of years ago with it, he worked out how to kind of use the particle systems to work out where water would flow, so a kind of hydrology model. You know, you set up a surface and you set particles with gravity and they kind of roll into the valleys, and then, you know, where they would naturally drain if, you know, there's a overland flow model. So a lot of this stuff is kind of working at, you know, it's got a cool set of things that it can do that can mimic reality or kind of simulate things from the environment. And that's about thinking about, well, you know, what can you do with that would be good in terms of use for architects and urban designers. So tetrahedron particle something. I don't know what input geometry, what that one's about either. But I think, yeah, so any other questions on, I think we've been through a fair bit now.
I missed how you added more like points on your spline.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I might do it on a separate spline just to make it simpler. So when you zoom in, I think the default 6 or something. When you go into your modifier, and I think it used to be up, moved it, but it used to be up here. So it's the first thing, and it's usually hidden because, well, I guess unless you're doing curvy stuff, you don't tend to tinker with it. But what Max does, the same when it does a sphere or something, it gives you an approximation of a sphere. It's not, and this is one of the big differences between something like Rhino, which is a NURBS modeler by default. This one is, Max is using polygons primarily, and it's an approximation of the geometry. It's not the pure mathematics. It's sort of simplifying to display more quickly and animate more quickly. So splines will be a little bit chunky, so you can see that's a curve, but to speed up the display, it kind of facets it. and sometimes that's fine. Sometimes it just looks a bit too ugly. And so what you want to do is go into the interpolation and increase that number. And the amount you need to increase it will basically depend on what you're doing. If that was, if you're wanting that curve to be super duper smooth, or you're going to loft a piece of geometry, shape across that and then 3D print it, and you wanted it to be beautifully smooth, then you might bump that up to be quite a high number. But it's usually about balancing, render times, how big your model is. If you're modeling a whole city, you kind of need to simplify your geometry a fair bit, fake some stuff with textures and all of these sorts of things. So, but that was just a long answer to a simple question. But yeah, interpolation. So just this guy.
Yeah, I think my problem was that I was trying to do it with straight lines, but it only works with curves.
Yeah, to get that curvy thing, yes, definitely. Any other questions?
Yeah, I just got a thing every time I open up 3ds now. Since downloading that stuff, it says, it's like warning that the plugin Tyflow failed to initialize, but then it was working in there, so I don't know what that means.
Okay. Sorry, you go, Jenny.
I think I do know. Like, I think I probably have a solution for this. Did you drag multiple Tyflow into the folder?
Yeah.
So you probably just need to drag the one match your version into the plugin folder. If you have like multiple Tyflows in there, then we'll have that error. So I have that one in the phone.
Okay.
You just need to delete the one not match your 3ds Max version.
I don't know which ones they are, but I'll figure it out.
And inside the folder it says 2020, 2019. Just pick the one that matches your 3ds Max version.
Yeah. So in your Max, if it says 2019, 2020, 2021, the only confusing bit is 2020 will work in 2020 and it'll also work in 2021. And I don't want to go off onto a rant about how lazy Autodesk is and that they do updates which aren't really updates. No, I won't do that. But for the fact that the plugins work in both 2020 and 2021 means they haven't really changed anything much. They didn't even bother to change the icons this year. Maybe swap the colors around a little bit, make it look like you're doing some work. All right. Well, I think unless there's any other questions. Okay, I'll